Hello, my name is Olaf Kleist. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies at the University of Osnabruck in Germany. I've been researching the volunteering for refugees for several years now, and over the period it has become really a new phenomenon that made civil society a relevant force in refugee protection. Volunteering for refugees is certainly not entirely new. While in modernity, refugee protection is ultimately a task of sovereign nation states, which they fulfill with mixed results, to be honest, volunteers have been instrumental in helping refugees during various historical events, at least since the 19th century, after the Second World War, during the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis, or also during the Yugoslav wars. What we have witnessed also in the last decade or so is something sometimes called volunteering tourism, a humanitarian engagement for a limited time period in the global south from often young people from the global north. This geography of compassion, as Mary Mustafa Nasset called it, is marked by its political distance. In contrast, what we are talking about here today is voluntary work for and with refugees within one's own political community, often in a local context. And this has become almost something like a social movement in some countries in Europe and beyond. We remember the pictures from Germany in 2015, from Greece and the Balkans, but also can look to France, Scandinavia, Canada. Thus, we see the emergence of a civil society opening up to newcomers and refugees. Yet, volunteering for refugees differs widely, and it is not without its own contradictions and challenges. So, I want to ask and address three questions here. First, in which context should we understand volunteering and grassroots action, and where does it come from? Secondly, who are the volunteers? Why do people volunteer in the context of the refugee crisis? And thirdly, what is the impact of volunteers and volunteering? What does it mean for the refugee community currently in Europe and for European society? Question one, in which context should we understand volunteering and grassroots action, and where does it come from? Volunteering, so people helping and supporting each other, is crucial to the coexistence and for societies across the world. For democracies in particular, volunteering is a quintessential activity that creates civil society as its own realm of the nation state. So Michael Walzer, for example, locates civil society between the private realm of the family and the institution of the state. Thus, civil society engagement is very much focused on its own community. That doesn't mean that volunteers might not deal with broader, even global issues, like climate change, for example. But their focus is usually on the local impact. Thus, an area that was really rare until recently, in reality and also in research, was volunteering for migrants. Only the humanitarian engagement for refugees has really put a new focus on their integration into the existing civil society. At the same time, volunteering for refugees highlights civil society's complicated relationship with the nation state. As I mentioned earlier, refugee protection is ultimately an obligation of sovereign states that more often than not, governments are reluctant to observe. Thus, volunteers sometimes find themselves fulfilling tasks that the state might be responsible for, like providing food, accommodation, and clothing. Sometimes they get in conflict with state institutions and refugee policies when laws hinder volunteering and integration work, or because volunteers might view migration and border policies as too restrictive. So civil society can be complementary, but also pitted against the state. In the latter case, when refugee policies are opposed, we might speak rather of social movements or political action. Volunteering for refugees often sits at the threshold between civil society engagement, focused on the political community and the integration of refugees, and social movements intent on changing refugee policies. It is usually a combination of both, but there are different tendencies from country to country. In Canada, Scandinavia, and Germany, volunteers can play an important role for state institutions, and we see much support for their activities, especially in municipalities. These are mostly immigration countries where refugees stay and where civil society is recognized with facilitating the integration. In other countries, in particular where governments are opposed to immigration or that are mostly transit countries, volunteering for refugees is seen as much more political. Here, helping refugees is rather connected to social movements and attempts to changing policies. Thus, we can speak of a continuum of volunteering for refugees. On the one hand, we have civil society engagement that is focused on its own political community and the reception and integration of refugees. On the other, we see political activism that works within a larger social movement in solidarity with refugees to change policies. Most volunteers are somewhere in between on this continuum, both helping and seeing this being connected to policies. And over time, they might move on the continuum to either being more engaged with helping or becoming more politicized. Question 2. Who are the volunteers? Why do people volunteer in the context of the refugee crisis? As I just mentioned, there are two elements to volunteering with refugees: civil society-oriented volunteering and volunteering as part of social movements. These have really two different origins, or are two different origins of the 2015 volunteering movement that we saw across Europe. On the one hand, we have the civil society that over the last several years really became more interested in helping refugees in a local context. It often started in the context of resettlement movements. We've seen this in Canada, for example, but also in Germany, where organizations try to engage people in their local communities to receive and accept and welcome newcomers who come through resettlement programs. So these volunteers have often worked with established refugee welfare groups, and these groups noticed over the last several years an increase in this volunteering engagement, that more and more people came out to help and volunteer. On the other hand, what we also saw at the same time was a greater engagement with refugees on a political level, especially on the radical left, with the so-called Refugees Welcome movement. These were often supporters of politically active refugees who supported political fights and political engagements, political movements of refugees themselves. In 2015, these two strands of volunteers, civil society and of the social movement, came together and merged into one social movement of volunteering for refugees. So rather than working in established organizations, most volunteers organized themselves in spontaneous initiatives and groups to help where help was needed. From rescuing new arrivals on Greek islands, to providing them with food and drinks, to supporting their transit, their arrival and the integration, teaching languages and helping with administrative work. Thus, we sometimes had people from the radical left working together with regular seniors, wanting to help their local community. It was a broad coalition that we saw in 2015, and the motives varied also over time. Together with my colleague Zead Karakayali, I undertook 2 surveys among volunteers who were working with refugees in Germany. We did one survey in the autumn of 2014 and the second one year later in the autumn of 2015. So before and just after what was called the so-called Summer of Refugees. And what we were interested in were mostly 2 things. Who are the volunteers? What do they do? And also, what were their motives? Why did they do this volunteering? And what we found was that volunteers in 2014, so before the summer of refugees, were really mostly students, so people in their 20s, from 20 to 30, and older people above 50 and especially over 60, so people who often were retired already. Also, volunteers were mostly active in larger cities. So the bigger the city, the more volunteers we would find on a percentage base. And by 2015, many of these elements that we found really shifted. So the age really changed so that people in their middle ages and between 40 and 50 became far more percentage-wise. And we saw a much more even distribution of people who volunteered age-wise. Also, the employment really changed in the employment structure. So in 2015, we saw percentage-wise less students, but more people who were actually employed, also some more retirees. And the same was true for the distribution across towns and cities. While there were particular more refugees still in really big cities, we saw a large increase of volunteering in small cities and small towns as well. And it was much more closer to an even distribution in the way people were distributed across German cities and towns in general. And we also saw a new distribution concerning religion. So more religious people started helping in 2015, and the confessions and the kind of religious beliefs that we saw among volunteers were much more closely related to the actual distribution of religious beliefs in Germany. So overall, what we saw in 2015 during the refugee crisis was that volunteering for refugees really reached the middle class. So it arrived in the middle of society. That doesn't mean that it was evenly spread throughout society. There were certain sections really we couldn't see much volunteering, but it was much more evenly distributed throughout the social makeup than it was in the years before. The only factor that is really obviously out of balance is gender. So in 2014, we found that 72% of volunteers working with refugees were actually female. And by 2015, this number even rose more to being 3/4 of volunteers being female. And this is hard to explain. Volunteering on social issues is often more of a women's issue, but what other studies have found is that over time, more men became involved. So the difference between men and women in volunteering on social issues has not really become equal, but become more equal. Yet, when it comes to volunteering for refugees, we see this discrepancy is getting even higher when we look at younger volunteers. So volunteers under 50, the discrepancy is that even 80% of volunteers are female. So this is really not easily explained, but what we can see is a certain correlation maybe, that while support for refugees is dominated by women, we can see that anti-refugee activists are mostly men. So there is a real discrepancy, a gender imbalance on a political issue of wanting to help refugees or being opposed to refugees. And this discrepancy points maybe also to the political implications and motives of the civil society engagement for refugees. Because very often we find that volunteers are motivated by opposing racism in the local communities, that they get engaged to oppose racist movements. And almost all volunteers told us that what they want to do is to change society, at least a little. However, political ideas among volunteers differ widely. and it's mostly young volunteers that are usually more politically engaged than older volunteers. So beyond the politics, there are also other motives. It's often just noted as wanting to help or some kind of humanitarian impulse on a local level. In 2015, we also found that media reporting was really important as a motivating factor, as well as the communal feeling that many people felt in the events that were happening at the time. And lastly, what we should not forget, and what is really important, is that these were not just European citizens who were helping. Among the volunteers were also many refugees who started helping out of personal experience. And these personal experiences went both ways. While we had people who started helping because of their own experience as refugees, we saw also that the experience of helping really changed the opinion and perception of refugees and civil society itself. Question 3. What is the impact of volunteers and volunteering? What does it mean for the refugee community currently in Europe and for European societies? There are a few studies that look at how volunteering impacts the long-term integration of refugees. These studies are mostly from Australia, and the impact is really important. And the reason for that is that integration is more than just finding housing and work, as it's often discussed. Integration in civil society is really crucial, and volunteering provides probably the best access to the immigration society. The two social scientists, Alistair Agar and Alison Strang, provided a conceptual framework for refugee integration to better understand what kind of domains and factors are relevant to the integration. What we can see in this conceptual framework is that on top there are a number of markers and means, employment, housing, education, and health, that need to be obtained in order to be fully integrated in society. On the bottom we see what Agar and Strang call the foundation for rights and citizenship, which is provided by the state. But in between, we find a number of factors and domains, namely the social connections and facilitators, that can be best provided by civil society. Agar and Strang refer here to Putnam's theory of social capital. And what volunteers can provide to refugees here are things like social bonds, social bridges, and social links. And these are the connections to society, to other members of society, connections to closer friends, and better connections to social institutions. These are all tasks that volunteers fulfill in their daily work with refugees. But they also provide the facilitators that are important. Languages and cultural knowledge, sometimes through education of language education or integration efforts, as well as safety and stability for refugees who come out of crisis and flight and find friends in volunteers. So volunteering is much more than just an initial help, an initial welcoming. It facilitates integration on a very fundamental level. But beyond facilitating integration for new members of civil society, volunteering for refugees also shapes civil society itself. Indeed, many volunteers discover in their own family histories migration and refugee narratives. So confronted with the narratives of refugees and migrants, they see their own history and their own family history, but also their national history and social history through a new lens. National histories are reimagined, remembering the histories of flight, displacement, and migration that were usually forgotten. Thus, new ideas of immigration societies are created in contact with refugees. Civil societies, traditionally thought of as being inward-looking and closed off, open up and become civil immigration societies. And this goes beyond national societies. In Europe, volunteers helped across the continent. They came from the UK, the Netherlands, and France to volunteer in Greece and the Balkans. Poles crossed the border to Germany to volunteer with refugees there. A common humanitarian society is formed in Europe in relation to refugees. So new connections are not just created between volunteers and refugees, but new connections and a new way of society is created between volunteers themselves that see themselves as acting together to creating a better European society. At the same time, we must not forget that civil society also sees much resistance to refugees and much racism. Populist movements against foreigners exist all over Europe and may not be underestimated. But there's also a civil society movement that welcomes refugees. And it's political in its creation of an open and humane society. So it's both humane and political. And if we do want to understand refugee policies in Europe, we cannot ignore volunteers and activists helping refugees anymore. If you want to read more about these issues, you can find links to our reports and some other publications. And I wish you much luck and hope you enjoy this lecture and all the following ones. Thank you.